Do you remember a moment where you felt completely free? For me, as a child, it looked a lot like riding around with my friends on my 10-speed. We would go out after school, we would kind of race around the neighborhood, and I remember as the sun would start to go down, my mom and dad would call us all in, call my siblings in, and they would of course obey right away, but I was a little reluctant. The rebel in me wanted to linger a little bit longer. And what I found in that space where I would just ride wild, hands, it was a really big deal to go with no hands. And we would kind of cross around the corner of the block and the wind would go through my hair and I would just feel God so close in this secret place. I felt completely free. Freedom for me meant vitality, which means full of life, full of spirit and passion and fervor. And there was something precious that I held with that idea of freedom. But then enters in life, right? Family and school and church and teachers and professors and your Sunday school teacher and your youth pastor and everything in you wants to please. And so there's something about me that really leaned heavily into striving and perfectionism. I just wanted to be liked. I wanted to be known. And over time, kind of the fear and approval of men and women got louder than the intimacy and union with God. And what's crazy is that when God created Adam and Eve, he created them for union with him. He didn't just need someone random to name the animals. He actually said, I want communion with my people. And so here he created Adam and then Eve, and we were the culmination of his creation. We were the crescendo, if you will, at the end of a whole 7 days of where he says, I want to walk with you in the garden. So I imagine them walking, in the cool of the day, right? I picture Adam and Eve, arm in arm with God and, they're cracking jokes and Eve throws her head back and she laughs and there's such a beautiful cadence that they have together as one, arm in arm. And then the fall happens, right? The fall and it twists everything. Sin is crazy like that. It'll take something that was meant to be so beautiful and it'll twist it just enough. It'll pervert it just enough to taint everything. And so where we wanted to please God and to adore him and love him, we all of a sudden shift our gaze to man and women and we want to please them. And so for me, that became this like striving, perfectionism, competition, keeping up. And so the freedom over here became a dual thing. I'm carrying this union with Jesus that's really free on my own in intimacy and vulnerability. But the minute I step outside my door, I'm straddled with this weight. And Paul tells us in Hebrews 12, he says, run the race that was meant for you, but lay aside the sins and the weights. And sometimes we focus so much on the sin, right? And we try to examine our heart and say, what are all the things that I've done wrong? But we sometimes neglect the weight. And the thing is, burden and bondage and chains are exactly that. They are weight. They are like dead weight on a runner that's just kind of limping across the finish line. And so what I want to do in these next 6 sessions in this study is talk about what are the ways to just lay that weight down at the feet of Jesus. He wants to take that for us. So Galatians is the book on freedom, and it's written to the church, not those outside the church. And the reason he wrote this to the church of Galatia is because what they wanted to do is they had received the gospel message of the cross and the resurrection, but then they wanted to add religion back on top of it. They wanted to layer it, and Paul, gets really loud about this in 6 chapters, 6 short and very direct chapters. And he says in chapter 5, it is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Stand firm then, and do not let yourselves be burdened again by a yoke of slavery. It was as if they had tasted and seen what the power of freedom really could be, kind of like you and I as children. We tasted when Jesus says, have the children come to me and forbid them not. As you have this childlike faith that is so hungry for this union and communion with God. But then when we are burdened with this yoke of slavery again, we want to kind of take it back and we want to hold both. And so Paul is getting very direct here. He says, do not be burdened again with the yoke of slavery. Don't run back. So we compete and we compare and we strive and we put a terrible pressure on ourselves to keep up. And here's the good news. We were not made to keep up. We were made to be free, to be who we already are. So about a decade after those sunset bike rides, I march off to college. Liberty. I only applied because they promised me a free sweatshirt, which I did not ever get. But I did get an education and I met the love of my life. And so when we met, Gabe and I, we would go out and we would just, I don't know if this is like normal for dating in college, but we would write our dreams like on these napkins. We would go out to this ice cream parlor because, that's what we did. We didn't have a lot of money for dates. And we would just look at the world through just like big eyes and big imaginations. And I think the Lord had stirred a knit thing in our hearts even then. We couldn't put it really down tangibly, but we just really sensed that God was so big and so vast, and he was, the center of our worlds and our universe. And we wanted to give like whatever days we had together in service to him. So we got married and we moved to Atlanta. And 3 years later, we welcomed our firstborn son, Cade Christian Lyons. And we learned 6 hours after his birth that he had Down syndrome. When something like this happens for anyone, when life just hits you and changes in a moment, what used to be important just goes out the window, and what you used to overlook becomes front and center. And so our priorities changed drastically that day when Cade was born. I was only 26, but my entree to motherhood looked like, okay, Lord, I really have no say in what you want to do or what you want for my life, and I just want to serve you, and my life is yours, whatever that looks like. So what we did, which is kind of unconventional, Gabe at the time was working at an organization as vice president and loved the work, was very passionate about the work, but just felt this deep conviction for the church to be known for what it's for and not what it's against. And there was a passion and a fervor there that he just wanted to give whatever time he had left to that. So we started this conference called Q, and our first was in Atlanta, and John Tyson attended that one, and he was actually starting a whole network of churches in New York City. And he invited Gabe to come up and speak to his congregation on the Upper East and Upper West and downtown. And so we did. It was a beautiful August weekend, and the grandparents were watching our kids, and I thought, we're just gonna relive this romantic weekend and get a weekend away. And after that Sunday, he's looking at me over coffee after all 3 services, and he said, "Can you imagine living here?" And I was like, no. Where do they buy all their groceries? It was just like, wait a minute, are you serious? And I could just tell, though, that he was going somewhere that I could kick and scream, which I actually did. I kicked and screamed for about 3 years. But eventually, we wound up pulling into Manhattan with 3 kids, 2 toy poodles, in a minivan, which is not cool anywhere, but in particular when you're pulling into Manhattan. And I thought that I was going to begin this midlife reset. I told my friends, like, we're going off to college, except this time with kids. Well, that actually isn't a thing. Like, people don't do that. But somehow in me, I was convinced that I was going to come to New York looking for meaning. And instead, I found surrender. And I can tell you to this day that meaning follows surrender. What does that look like? Okay, 4 months into our time in New York, I had my first panic attack. And this happened on a plane, and I was a crazy person running towards the galley while we're still trying to land. And this began in trains and elevators and subways and crowds. And if you've ever been to New York, you know it's impossible to avoid these things. And over the span of about the next 12 to 18 months, I became crippled. I would be so afraid just to jump on the train to go to my daughter's school for chapel. I would just almost like strip off my scarf and my coat and my coffee, even in the subway. Sometimes I would try to claw the doors back open. Anxiety became my fancy word for fear. When you go from being a high-functioning, high-performing, achieving individual to not being able to breathe on your own during the night, you suddenly feel your weakness and your smallness. I'll never forget about a year into this, September 20th of 2011, I went into a Tuesday morning Bible study that I've been doing with friends. Looking back, it was essentially a support group. But we read the word together, we prayed together, we went through books together. And that particular morning, they said, "How is your anxiety?" And there was this side of me that was like, "It's fine." Like, I didn't really want to talk about it that much, but they got it out of me, and I was like, it's really hard. It's constant. And they laid hands and they prayed for me, and I was like, "That's awesome. Thank you. I mean, you have more faith than me at this point." And we went about our day. Well, in the middle of the night at 3 a.m., I had the same full-on panic attack like so many nights before, and I woke up and I was just gripping my husband's arm, and I'm like, I can't even speak. The adrenaline is out of control, and he gets up and he starts to pray. And I promise you, in a moment, the Spirit of God came over me, and I said, "Rescue me, deliver me. I cannot do this without you." And in a moment, my body broke, and I just lay there flat on the bed, and nothing moved, only my eyes. There might be a name for this in Pentecostal circles, but this Baptist girl had no idea what was going on. But what happens with healing, which is really remarkable, is that when you're sick, you only see yourself, right? You only see inward, you're looking down. But when the scales fall from your eyes, you begin to see and look and see beyond yourself. And I walked out of my apartment that next morning, and I began to see women just like me, gripped in fear. And I started to just meet with women in my church. I wrote an article called "Why Are Women Fading?" And it just talks about how so many of us chasing the freedom that we glimpsed in our childhood or glimpsed marching off to college, ready to charge hell with a water pistol. Somehow, a decade or two later, we find ourselves lost. Like these bright shining stars that have somehow faded and somehow grown dim and lost sight of who we are and whose we are. And as women responded, I saw a desire in women, God waking something in them, like almost breathing something back to life, like taking away the numbness and the coping and just the medication of whatever that looked like, whatever it looked like to just get through the day, and activating and animating something in their spirit. Weeks later, I was reading through Psalm 18 and reminded of that night in September. And the words of David just resounded in my ears. He says this, he says, "I love you, Lord, my strength. The Lord is my rock, my fortress, my deliverer. In my distress, I called to the Lord, and I cried to my God for help." From his temple, I love this. It's like, he's not too far away, guys. He's like, from his temple, he heard my voice, and my cry came before him into his ears. It just shows it's like, all it is like, just, you're only a phone call away, but it's not even a phone call. You're only just a cry away. You just raise your hands to the heavens and say, "Rescue me, deliver me." From his temple, he heard my cries. My cry came before him into his ears, and he reached down. I love this. It's like he reacts to our cries. He reached down from on high and took hold of me, and he drew me out of deep waters, and he rescued me from my powerful enemy, from my foes who were too strong for me. They confronted me in the day of my disaster, but the Lord was my support. He brought me into a spacious place. He rescued me because he delighted in me. To the faithful, you show yourself faithful. To the blameless, you show yourself blameless. To the pure, you show yourself pure. As for God, his way is perfect. The Lord's word is flawless. Who is God besides the Lord? And who is the rock except our God? It is God who arms me with strength and makes my way secure. So as I began to share this story with women over coffee or meals and listen to their stories as well, I began to gain a greater understanding of this idea of calling. So what's wild about calling is a few years prior to this, before we ever moved to New York, I remember on my 35th birthday, Gabe said, "Hey, for your birthday, I'd love to send you out for a couple days to meet with this guy named Pete, who was a life coach and helped people walk through what calling looked like for them. And he asked me so many questions about like, what are your talents, your birthright gifts, the things that make you sing, make your heart sing, make you come alive. And what's funny is I remember, in 4th grade, I was called Becca Book because we didn't have a TV till I was in 8th grade. So, when you're bored and there's nothing to do, you read and you read and read and read and read. But I would go back to the library every other day after school and get the next book out. And I lost myself in the power of story. I learned about life through the power of story. And what I didn't know then that I learned much later, at age 33, I remember my mom pushing my youngest on a swing and she's like, I always thought you'd write. And I'm thinking, are you kidding me? I've never heard this before. That would have been super helpful when I'm picking a major, right? When I started putting my thoughts and feelings to paper, kind of even the journey of New York, I think the Lord knew that I'm a chronic oversharer. And if he gave me an experience that was so transformative, over time, I probably would not be able to be quiet about it. And so this just evolved into writing. And so that was kind of the birthright gift piece. But Pete asked another question that was a lot more gutting. A lot of people in the world wake into their talents. They know what they're gifted for and they run hard and fast after it. The piece we kind of want to shove to the side or tuck under the rug is the burden piece. Burden is informed by the life you've lived, the family you were born into, the story and journey you've walked. It's informed by the thing that broke your heart. And when I look back on my story and my journey, I remember just watching mental illness in my own family, in my own upbringing, watching it in others around me. And then when I gave birth to my firstborn son of special needs, of mental disability, I was sandwiched in between, a generation in between. And when panic became part of my story, I thought, well, this is kind of my cross to bear. This is my story. This is what I'm just going to have to live with. And it was very much indeed the thing that broke my heart. I was just like, yes, I know that this is what God wired me for. And I know this is the thing. Mental illness breaks my heart. And he said, what if calling is where your talents and your burdens collide? What if calling is where God uses the things that he knit in you when he created you in your mother's womb to redeem the things that broke your heart? And what's wild is back at Liberty, I had memorized Psalm 139. I don't know why. I mean, it's not often that you just decide in college you're going to memorize a whole chapter, and it wasn't an assignment and I wasn't getting graded. But there's something, just like when I quoted Psalm 18, Psalm 139 was this beautiful picture of the intimacy that David felt with God about how he created him. And he says, Lord, you search me and you know me. You know when I sit and when I rise. You perceive my thoughts from afar. You know my going out and my lying down. You're familiar with all my ways. Before a word is on my lips, you know it completely. You hem me in behind, and before you place your hand upon me. This kind of knowledge is too wonderful. It's too, where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I go in the heavens, you're there. If I go in the depths, you're there. Even there, and the right hand of the sea, side of the sea, even New York City, even there, your hand will guide me and your right hand will hold me fast. But what I love the most about that psalm is he said, for you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. When I think about that season in New York, it was not my story of struggle. It was his story of rescue. If calling is where our talents and our burdens collide, then what does that look like for you? Can you remember a moment where you just came alive as a kid and your natural things that you loved just came out and they were effortless for you? And maybe over time, they just got buried. Parker Palmer says that we all come into this world with birthright gifts, but early on, we abandon them or disabuse them. But if we are aware and awake and able to admit our loss, we'll spend the second half of our lives reclaiming the gifts we once possessed. I'd love to close with the words of Paul in Ephesians. May you walk worthy of the calling you've received, humble and gentle, bearing one another in love.